You would think there wouldn't be anything to talk about the font called Arial. Arial is everywhere. It's in your browser, it's in your word processing, and if you use a Windows PC, you've been familiar with it for many years. But I'm going to tell you the hidden history of Arial, why I still don't like it, and what you should use instead. Ready to go? Hi, I'm Stuart and I am your middle-aged hack, just a child of the 80s trying to make his way through the 20s. And this time we're talking about Arial, one of the most boring and yet ubiquitous fonts that are out there. In order to understand Arial, you have to understand a little bit about its history. And in order to understand its history, you have to start with a completely different font and a rivalry that lasted well over 50 years. First thing you need to know is learn about Helvetica. Now you can find an excellent documentary about Helvetica that was made in 2007, and if I find a link to it, I'll put it in the description. So I'm not going to talk too much about Helvetica, other than the fact that when it came to the United States and started getting used in the late 50s and early 60s, it was a revolution. It started being used everywhere, and you can see Helvetica in train stations, you can see it in bus stations, you can see it on signage. It is the most popular font in the world, give or take, depending on who you ask. Helvetica was used in some of the earliest laser printers. But this isn't really about Helvetica. This is about two companies, one called Linotype and one called Monotype. Linotype was American, and they had the license for Helvetica, and Monotype was British, and they didn't. Monotype didn't really worry too much about it because they had a number of really other excellent fonts that were in use, and they didn't really try to infringe too much upon it for years and years and years. But these two companies had a rivalry that lasted a long time, and it ended, spoiler alert, with Monotype buying the Linotype type library and essentially shutting Linotype down in the early 2000s. Now, let's get back to Arial. You would think that Arial is something of a recent invention, but it's not. It's one of the earliest computer typefaces out there, and actually predates Helvetica in its use. Arial was invented by a pair of typographers named Robin Nicholas and Patricia Saunders. These two, working out at Monotype's headquarters in the middle of the Sonoran Desert, were tasked with coming up with a font for IBM laser printers in the 1980s. Back in those days, every printer was different, every printer had a different set of fonts, and IBM came to Monotype and said, we want a version of Helvetica that we can use on our laser printers. And Monotype said, well, we don't do Helvetica, but we're going to do something special for you. And they created a font called Sonoran Sans. That was the first thing they named it. And it was almost identical to Helvetica with a couple of different kind of tweaks to it. IBM liked it, they put it in their laser printers, and that's where the story kind of sat for a while. Along the way, somebody decided that Sonoran Sans should be called Arial, and I'll be honest with you, I've done whatever research I can, and nobody seems to 100% know why it's called Arial. One website suggests that it is something that sounds really techy and forward-thinking, but Arial is another word for an old-school TV antenna, so that doesn't make a lot of sense. And this was before The Little Mermaid came out, so that doesn't make a lot of sense. Nobody seems to really know why they called it Arial. Now, the story of Arial gets real interesting in the early 1990s. Apple had come up with the Macintosh, and the Macintosh had its own laser printer, and that laser printer used fonts from Linotype, including Helvetica. Microsoft and Apple didn't get along very well at that time. And Microsoft wanted to develop its own laser printer language, so they didn't have to worry about Apple and Adobe, who were super tight at those times. And they wanted to make sure that there were basically versions of every font, so that they want every basic font that was available on Apple laser printers, they wanted something extremely similar on their laser printers. And so they set about going to Monotype, who they had this partnership with, and creating versions of these fonts that they could call their own. The team at Monotype went back to Arial and they adjusted it so that the same words in Arial took up exactly the same space as those words in Helvetica. That's what they did with all of their original TrueType fonts. This was done so that basically everything would look exactly the same one way or the other. You wouldn't be able to tell the difference, and that's a good thing. Arial debuted with Windows 3.1, and it's been with us ever since. There are two really important ways that Arial and Helvetica are different. First of all, when you look at Helvetica, there are a whole bunch of different variations, from the super thin, super condensed, all the way to the super dark, super wide. I think there's something like 80 different versions of Helvetica, depending on how wide you want it to be. Well, there are essentially 2.5 versions of Arial. There's the regular, which comes with a bold and italic. There's the narrow, which comes with a bold and italic. And then there's the black. There's nothing bolder than Arial Black. So right away, people who set type for a living and did graphic design hated Arial because they loved all the flexibility that Helvetica gave them and Arial didn't. Arial doesn't have this flexibility because regular folks don't care. When Microsoft designed the TrueType standard, they designed it so that the letters could get more and less condensed, and you didn't have to have different fonts for that. Even though it didn't look as good, most people didn't care. And Arial to this day does not have anywhere near the number of variations that Helvetica does. The second thing that graphic designers and typesetters didn't like about Arial is there were just a couple of letters that didn't look quite right. The folks at Monotype wanted to go back to their own history when designing Arial. And so they looked back to one of their most popular fonts of the 20th century called Gill Sans. Gill Sans is the font that's most similar to the London Underground. You see it all over Great Britain. It's thought of as a quintessentially British typeface. And it is incredibly popular. And remember, Monotype started as a British company. For whatever reason, even though they didn't have to, the folks who designed Arial took some of the quirkier bits of Gill Sans and translated them out to Arial. Take a look at this G and this R in Gill Sans. You see how the G has got a straight bit to it, where in Helvetica it's set up differently. It's got a little plank on the top and stuff like that. And take a look at the R. Now the R in Gill Sans is kind of what they call a waterfall R. It goes out and then it comes down in a little bit ungraceful way. The R in Helvetica is extremely graceful, and the R in Gill Sans is extremely ungraceful. And they took the R in Gill Sans, they adapted it for use in Arial, and it just looks kind of funky. And graphic designers see that R and they just kind of wince. It's overly kludgy and wedgy and doesn't look graceful at all, especially compared to the very, very nice capital R that you get with Helvetica. And those two letters by themselves constitute the real reason that a lot of professionals don't like Arial. For a long time, Arial was sort of your only choice when it came to Microsoft Windows. You could buy other fonts, but they were very expensive. So it was used in Internet Explorer, it was used in Word, it was used in Excel and Outlook and all these tools that basically everybody had. Luckily, when Microsoft decided to change things up in the late 2000s, they pushed Arial a little bit to the side and they started promoting a font called Calibri that they had designed completely from scratch to be legible on screens. This became a trend in the 2010s with designing type to really have it be legible on small screens because nobody prints things anymore. And Calibri is, I think, better than Arial because of that. It's more consistent. It doesn't have the same kind of neutrality that Arial does. It's got more of a personality to it, which isn't a bad thing. I still didn't super like it, and I still liked Helvetica better. Well, the latest change in the early 2020s was to a new font called Aptos. And if you're still using Microsoft apps, you'll see that they now use Aptos, which is a much more business-like font. It still looks good at small sizes, and it's got a good character to it. Do I think it's better than Helvetica? No. Do I think it's better than Arial? Definitely. And so, unless you absolutely have to, I would avoid using Arial. Use either Helvetica or Aptos instead, and whatever you're doing is going to look a lot better. Anyway, that's it for the story for today. Please like and subscribe, leave a comment. I'm trying to build up this channel, and I can only do that with your help.